Hey everybody, back in the office and got my old-time movie filter going on my webcam as usual. And today I want to talk a little bit about something a little different. Instead of just playing around with VFX software or tips and tricks or, breaking apart a project, I thought I'd talk a little bit about presentation and presenting your work, which is really just as important as having amazing work. If you have a lousy website and that's what you're using to get a job out there, that's going to go a long way towards people saying, is this person a professional? Are they serious about this? And one thing that I see a lot of, and because specifically I come from a graphic design background originally, is that websites do not handle type and fonts very well at all. Even the professional sites, the professional templates, the quote-unquote best practices for working with how a website actually looks still presents a lot of challenges in the way you want it to be shown and the way it's actually shown to the audience. And I'm going to take a look at a couple of websites right now to show you what I mean, and I'm going to show you, most importantly, how to fix all that. So let's take a look at some websites, and here's one by Alan McKay. He's a very popular VFX artist. He's got a lot of great courses and tips and all kinds of stuff like that, tutorials. But let's just take a look at his site, okay? And it looks pretty cool right off the bat. It's a big splash image here, and you got this headline going right here: explode your visual effects skills and level up your career, right? Sounds good. Who doesn't want to do that? If you notice, if I change the resolution, now you never know what the resolution of your user is going to be. Are they looking at it on a phone or a watch or a huge 4K or 6K monitor? Who knows, right? So let's just play around a little bit with this and just take a look at really quickly the hierarchy of the type versus the pictures versus the accessories like buttons and stuff like that. And right now, at this kind of basic resolution, it looks pretty good, right? The type has a good sense of hierarchy. This is the most important thing, so it's the biggest, and a nice large button. It's not super overpowering, and then a nice button right here of good size, right? But of course, if someone was looking at it like this, a little bit bigger, the wrapping changes, and now it looks a little odd for a graphic designer to look at and say, why is everything all on one line? And then you have this orphan line on this line. Now, I'm not saying Alan McKay did something wrong here. This is a template. You're kind of limited to what the template is doing or the text wrap is doing based on resolution, but you can fix all of this, right? So that doesn't look great, right? If I make it even bigger, it still kind of stays the same. But here's another thing. If I get even smaller, take a look at up here. The button up here, it's kind of freaking out a little bit, and it's really close to the text that says "Why Alan." Whereas over here, it's a bit easier to read, bit more spaced nicely. But shrinking that up, that button gets a little funny, and especially if I shrink this up a little bit even more, just a little bit more with the resolution. Now look what happened. All of a sudden, our graphic design hierarchy has completely changed. Now it says, "Are you ready to?" which is much larger than originally the headline right here. The headline is way, way, way smaller than it was. And now this button here is overpowering, okay? Because the button doesn't scale, the texts aren't scaling well. And the button over here, start here, get the most out of the site. It's actually wrapping. It's actually off the button, right? It's vertically misaligned with that right there. So there's a lot of things that we could look at and say, how can we actually fix this? I'm going to shrink it down even more. Now we go to a little hamburger up here for the navigation, shrinking it down even more. And the button is definitely having some issues. And nothing really changes here on the text, right? And the button here, this play button is still absolutely huge. If we wanted to look at this on a phone, maybe it looks great on a phone. Let's take a quick look. Here it is on a phone, right? And it's looking better because it knows, most phone resolutions can deal with a stable kind of template. Again, the button here isn't great. This button here is kind of huge, and it doesn't matter what I change here. It's going to look fairly the same unless we actually spin this. Let's spin this a little bit. Let's see what happens. And the button is still quite huge compared to the headline, stuff like that. But again, this button is here. So you, as a graphic designer or a visual effects artist or any kind of artist, says, hey, this is how I want my work presented. And I don't want to be stuck with some technological limitation of a device or a browser or whatever to kind of dictate how my work is going to be shown, even if it's something as simple as a headline. Now, a lot of people may look at, his website and say, hey, I don't care what his website looks like. I just want to see the work. And granted, Alan McKay is probably not going to be hired for a web design job. If he was, maybe he'd pay more attention to this. I'm not saying this is his fault at all. He's focusing on his stuff, and maybe his web team, or maybe a couple of people can say, hey, let's kind of fix this on the site. And we're going to do that today. So I'm going to jump back out to this here, the main site, and jump down a little bit. And you can see right here he is, a kid from Australia, high school dropout, 14, with his heart set, funny return, on Hollywood, right? And then again, shrinking this down, the type stays the same. It's kind of freaking out a little bit as I jump up. And now look, now the body copy is almost as big as the headline. And the subheadline is, I think, bigger than the main headline. So what's going on here? We need to get consistency on all this stuff. And I'm going to show you how to do that right now, regardless of what site you're on, what template you're using, because all of these website templates and companies, they all allow you to add a little bit of code to your site. And that's what we're going to add to our site here. And we're going to add a little bit of JavaScript. And don't worry, it's not a big deal at all. If you're a visual effects artist, if you like, coding up in any kind of thing like Python or Mel, or really any programming language, JavaScript is actually one of the easiest ones. And to fix this is just going to be a few lines of code and you're going to be all set. I don't want to critique the graphic design here. I don't even know Alan. I'm sure he's a very nice person and he's very, very smart. Okay, so I put together this quick little test, a montage of different graphics with different text overlaid on them. And as you can see, none of this is actual font work that's placed as far as rasterized type in the image itself. It's all editable HTML text that can be changed or customized depending on whatever you have to say in your project. And it's a kind of an important thing is you really don't want to put a whole lot of text as graphics in your website, even if it looks perfect that way, because SEO and Google bots, they're not able to really scrape that content very well. And so if you want something to be able to be increased in Google searches and stuff, then you really want it to be editable text. So those little spiders and bots that crawl all over the internet that search for phrases and text can find your stuff and make it more searchable. So anyway, a couple of quick things I just threw together. This type is sitting pretty much right in the middle of this marble slab, Lincoln Project. Of course, that's not Abraham Lincoln, right? That's the twist from Planet of the Apes, from Tim Burton's version of it. If you haven't seen that, it's spoiler. I just ruined the ending for you. But I figured that would be fun to kind of put in there. This is a simple wedding invitation. This is all type right here. Anthony Stark and Pepper Potts getting married, right? With some fun type. Old newspaper from the Old West. If anybody's a Back to the Future fan, Doc Brown shot in the back. Of course, that really didn't happen in the movie, but it was threatened to happen by Buford Mad Dog Tannen over a matter of $80 is what he says in the movie, and that's I love that franchise. And then this is just something I threw together. It just says nothing. It's a nothing burger, right? But the important thing to know here is that if I scale this, if I move the browser, somebody's looking at this on a very large screen. Let's just scale all the way up to my 4K monitor. If I scale this up nice and large, as you can see, the type work still looks exactly the same. And as you watch and I scale it all the way down, here's the key. It's also scaling perfectly, and there's no jumping, there's no funny business. It's not, the type isn't moving, it isn't going in strange margins or strange areas. And you can actually go down all the way to the very, very, very bottom. You can make this teeny tiny postage size, and everything looks exactly where you want it to be as far as placement and size and margins and all those fun things that graphic designers and web designers like to see. So that's really important. No matter what I do on this browser size, it's always going to look perfect. And that's important because you don't know what resolution people are looking at your site. If you look at this perhaps on a phone or a tablet or whatever the case may be, guess what? It's going to look exactly the same. And I could shrink down my browser, one way or the other, and it's all going to be perfect. Never changes, which is the goal here, which is the key of what we're trying to do in this campfire. Now I'll show you how I did this after I show you now the traditional way that web designers code this up, and the traditional way, the quote unquote right way to do it, which is a terrible way in my opinion, and that's called using media queries. What are media queries? And by the way, this is the bad version of the page we're looking at with media queries. What are they and how are they actually used? Well, if we take a quick look at the code, I'm going to jump over to the pages that I coded up. And this is just the simple HTML right here. And by the way, I'll give you all this code if you want. I'll just put it in a Google link at the bottom of this YouTube video. And then here are the media queries. And it basically just looks like this. This is a standard CSS document. And don't think that, wow, what's all that type? That looks confusing. It's not. It's just repeated things because I have 4 or 5 or 6 different type treatments on the same page. That's all. But what a media query is it actually says, hey, in the CSS, in the cascading style sheets, it says, what's the resolution of the browser? And whatever that is, make the certain fonts that I'm using a certain size. And right now this says, hey, if the browser is 525 pixels, which is really, really skinny, right? That's almost like phone size. Then make these fonts, Impact, Barlow, Wedding, Western Font, all the fun stuff that we just saw, make them these font sizes. If the browser changes, the browser screen changes, maybe it goes up to 768, which is a very common resolution breakpoint for media queries. A breakpoint, as I'll explain that in a second. Then the types change. The font sizes go up a bit, right? Now the screen gets bigger, 1024, the fonts get bigger, right? 1280 is another breakpoint, very common. Fonts get bigger. 1600, fonts get bigger. So all you're basically doing is asking the computer, how big is the canvas, and make the fonts that size. So going back over here to our media queries, and here's the problem, is that whenever I move this around slightly, as you can see, it doesn't change. The type doesn't change because it's sitting on that one font size. But as soon as I hit a breakpoint, the fonts change. Like look right over here. Doc Brown shot in the back. If I move this up and down, as you can see, maybe I wanted the type to be flush to the ends of our newspaper here, but with media queries you can't get that until it hits kind of a sweet spot in your resize browser, and then guess what? It's going to hit a breakpoint, and it's going to try and change that type again. And as you can see, everything's looking really ugly, right? That's not how you want things to look because it's in the middle of a breakpoint, right? So I changed that to get close to where it wants again, and this looks pretty decent. But again, this only looks decent on this resolution that says, well, what is the resolution? We can actually just take a quick look if I just do a quick inspection here. Changing our resolution, 768-ish is looking pretty good. Anything beyond that, before I hit that breakpoint, and let me close this out again, anything that goes almost to the point where it hits that next breakpoint where it has to change the font is going to look the worst it's ever going to look. Like right over here, this doesn't look good in anyone's graphic design sensibilities, right? And I could shrink this way down and it hits another breakpoint, just looks like crap. This is the common way to code up websites. If I go very large and hit another breakpoint, which is probably going to be around 1280, and let's see, where is that? There it is. It hits that breakpoint, but right before it, everything kind of looks like garbage, doesn't it? This is the way they tell you to code. This is a terrible way because it makes sites look like, well, I'm not going to say garbage, but it doesn't make sites look very nice, especially when you look at it and you say, wow, that is definitely what I didn't intend when I designed this up, perhaps. So let's throw out the quote-unquote right way to do it, the breakpoint, the media queries, get rid of that crap, and let's just put a couple of little JavaScript lines in our page. And what's wonderful about the JavaScript code that we're going to write here is it works on every single website. Unless for some weird reason somebody has JavaScript turned off in their browser, then it won't work. But that's not the only thing that's not going to work. Almost nothing on the web is going to work if someone has JavaScript turned off. So JavaScript is always turned on, and it's just a simple coding language that really helps things look nice on the web. Okay, so before we start, like I said, don't get too worried about trying to copy or keep up with whatever code I'm typing here, because I'm going to include all the code into the link of this video. I just want to give you like a little tour of what I already have. I made the fonts nice and big so we could see it on the video as well. And I'll just kind of step through a little bit of how I set up a website with the scaling fonts to have it very modular and very user-friendly. Okay, so really simply, this is just the HTML right over here. This is the CSS right over here. Before we go any further, I've folded all the code up. I'm going to get rid of all these media queries because yuck. These things, I think they suck. So I'm just going to delete all of those. We don't need that stuff. And then we're going to start with right over here. And if you recall the actual image, basically all we really have is 4 pictures with type, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And the code is basically broken up into that same system. We have a section that says all images container, and it's basically just, I use flex boxes all over the place. So the scaling really goes really well with mobile devices and desktop devices. And then this is just the Lincoln image, the wedding image, the newspaper one, and then the burger one. That's all it really is right here. And maybe we'll just take a look at the Lincoln image. And they're basically all exactly the same. It's just another section tag that encompasses the whole graphic. I have a generic background image. I have a class that says Lincoln project container. If I go up to that class right over here, I have some body tags, making sure the background is black. And I'll explain what this stuff here is in a minute. But all image container, all that really does is just say, hey, everything's in a flex box. It's 100% of the browser window and it wraps. The Lincoln project container is simply just another flex box. It's 40% of the screen. And the position of all these images, these background images here, are all relative. So the type sitting on top of the image can all be absolute. That's just a CSS position tag. And then I just basically just put it as a percentage wherever it is according to, in relation to, the image itself. So that's the same process, just used over and over again. So the background image, generic background image, right over here is assigned to all of them. It's just a flex box. And then there's the image right there. And then another class of type right on top of it. For example, the Lincoln text. Here's where I tell it that it's absolute in positioning. It's another flex box, of course, the color of the font. And then the top is basically how far down the type starts. And then the placement, of course, centers everything up. But we're not really going to talk about any of that stuff. It repeats on everybody else. But the important thing here is these classes that actually dictate the font. Now, I know you can jump out to Google Fonts, or you can choose whatever font if you're using a WYSIWYG editor. WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get. And these fonts, they're great. You can just click on one of them, and then you can get the embed code, and you can do all kinds of stuff like that. But you actually aren't limited to Google Fonts. You could actually just put any font at all on a website, even your own personal fonts. And so all you really have to do is, like for example, the Impact font that actually comes with Windows, I just go up here to the font face in the CSS sheet, and I just say, hey, font family is Impact. The source is basically where it is located on your server or in relation to the website. This is a true type. You could use really any of the formats that the fonts come with, open type and all the rest of them. But even true type, the old standard, still works fine. And then once you've defined that font face, then I just assign a class that says Impact. And it just says, hey, grab the font family that I've dictated to up here and use the Impact font. So now, no matter where I am in my website, if I need to have a font of a certain type, I can just go in and say, hey, give me, the actual font that's wedding, or the font that's Old West, or the font that's Helvetica, or whatever it is the case may be. So whenever I'm using type, I usually assign 2 classes to it before I type anything out. It's the font and it's the size. And basically, that's all you're doing in graphic design, is just establishing what the font is and what the size is. And I'm going to show you how we do that in JavaScript here in half a second. So all the other code here is basically just a duplicate of just this little flex box right here. Puts an image down, makes it relative positioning, and then you could just put the font in there and you're all set to go. Now, let's figure out how we can get different sizes in here. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is bring in JavaScript library called jQuery. And jQuery is just a simple addition library to JavaScript that you can put on any page. And the link is just like this. You just put it right up here in the head, and here's the script, and it says, hey, go get this jQuery code, this library, so to speak, and grab one of the latest versions, and that's it. Now, this doesn't write any code for you. It just opens up different libraries that you can code with that makes the front-end coding a lot simpler. It just kind of condenses a lot of code into something that's a little bit easier to work with. But everything I'm doing here, you can certainly do in vanilla JavaScript as well. Same thing. It's just kind of a way we're formatting the code. So I'm just going to throw that right up here in the header, just like that. And now we're going to write a function that determines that whenever the page is loaded or whenever the page is rescaled or resized in the browser, it's going to go through all the fonts and it's going to resize them accordingly. And as you can see, every time I'm actually moving my browser window open and close, or if I refresh it, or reload it, it just runs through all the font work very, very quickly and just makes sure it's the exact size that's needed before it even shows itself to the user. So let's do that real quick. I'm going to go right up here in my header and I'm going to create a new script, just like that. And this is going to be a new function. You can call it anything you like. I'm going to call mine refresh text. Open and close bracket. We don't need any arguments in this function, and then the open and close brackets, and I'm going to open that up, and here's what we're actually going to type. We'll give ourselves a little bit of room, and maybe I'll make this even a little bit bigger so we could see exactly what I'm typing. All right, we've got a nice big easy to read font right here for our code editor. And the first thing we actually need to do is what's actually determining the size of the fonts? How does it know what size to actually be? Well, all it's really doing is it's just measuring the width of the current browser window. And the width is basically always going to be a number that's brought back as you measure it. And then we could just use a percentage of that value to make sure that the fonts are always consistent in their font size. So the code I'm going to need to figure that out is simply, let's make a variable, new width. And this is going to be equal to window dot inner width. And that's just a built-in function in JavaScript that says, hey, get the pixel size of the browser window. That's all that is. Now, I like to have a lot of control over all of the fonts in my page. And for that, I basically create a global multiplier, basically a global switch that says at any little change of this global switch, I can increase or decrease the size of all the fonts completely, all the type, all the text in my entire site, which makes things really simple. So I'm going to create that little global multiplier right now. And guess what? I'm going to call it global multiplier. And for this page, you can really start out with anything. I'm going to start it out with like 0.2. And what this actually is doing is it's actually taking the size of the browser window and it's dividing it down to a smaller number that is more in line with what font sizes usually are. Now you could say 0.2. I know for a fact that my global multiplier on this page is actually 0.17. That's how I kind of like the values. But you can play around with this, and all this does is just increase or decrease the global size of all the fonts in the entire site. And what we're going to do now is we're going to create a series of classes. And these classes are just going to be called size 1, size 2, size 3, all the way up to size 10. And that's going to make it really, really easy, because every time you add a font or a type to your website, you can just assign it a size and a font and you're good to go. So for example, this headline right here, it's pretty big, right? So maybe we'll say the classes assigned to this would be Western font, and the size is maybe, I don't know, size 5, right? Now this font here, same font, so it's the Western font, but it's much smaller, so maybe he's size 2 or 3. And once you assign these classes, then you could really fly through your website and say, hey, this is size 1, this is size 7 for big headlines, this is size 4, whatever the case may be. It's basically exactly the same as a graphic or web designer assigning font sizes for headlines and copy, like, hey, this is 12 point, 14 point, 18, 24, 36, all the typical font sizes and point sizes that you would use in graphic and web design. So let's make a new variable, and we're just going to call it font sizer. Just like that. And it's equal to, well, we already grabbed the width of the browser window, so let's grab that width right there. So it's equal to the new width. Now, right off the bat, that font size is going to be huge. It's going to be like, if we were on a 4K monitor, our font size is now 4096. That's way too big, right? So the first thing we're going to do is, let's actually multiply this by our global multiplier, which chops it way down to something a little bit more useful, right? And now we're actually going to write. So now one of the first classes we're actually going to write would be maybe the font size 5. And by the way, you don't actually need this little $sign in front of the variable. I just use that sometimes because I write a lot in jQuery, but let's just actually just leave that off for now just to avoid any confusion. But we are going to use a jQuery function now, which actually coincides with how you assign CSS attributes to anything on the page. And it's basically just a jQuery ID identifier. You could use IDs or you could use classes. And we're going to use classes all over the place instead of IDs because identifiers have to be unique on the screen. Classes do not. And you may want multiple things on your page that say, hey, we're all going to use maybe the same class, class 5. And that's why we're using classes instead of IDs here. So let's say jQuery, that little $sign here is a shortcut for using a jQuery library. And I'm going to grab an identifier of any class that's using, say, size 5. So we're going to put it in quotes. The period denotes the class. We'll say size 5. There he is. And we're going to change the CSS, the styling of this, because that's where the fonts live, in the styling. Open and close the parentheses. The actual content of the style sheet that we're changing is the font size, of course. So there's font size, and then the attribute itself. So I'm going to say comma, and typically font sizes in websites are any kind of number with a PX after it. Stands for pixels, right? And what did we already create right up here? Font sizer. So let's just copy that variable, and it's going to be that value. And of course, we also need to actually give it the PX label on top of it. And you could put the PX label right here, or you could put it up here. Probably would make more sense to put it up here because you don't have to repeat that all the time, but let's just put it down here for clarity. And then a semicolon that denotes the end of that. And now you're good to go. You've just created a size 5 for anything that may have size 5 across the board. So how do we actually utilize this class? Well, if I go down to, say, the newspaper container, and I have here Doc Brown shot in the back, it's the Western font, but it doesn't show you, it doesn't tell the computer what actual size I want it to be. So I'm just going to say class is Western, space, add another class that coincides with that font size, and I'm just going to say this is size 5. And you're basically just going to mix and match fonts and sizes as you go through all your code. That's all there is to it. So now there's a couple more things that I want to show you, and then you can be off and running on your own. Number one is this font size is still going to be much too large. And if I create size 5 and maybe duplicate it for size 4, well, there's no difference between the two. Right now, everything is going to be the exact same size. So what I do with this global multiplier here is I put a number in the font sizer that actually coincides with every time I want to run one of these styles, it's going to get the new value of whatever font sizer it is. So this value is always going to be changing. So I'm going to copy this and I'm going to paste it right here. So what this is actually doing is it's figuring out what font sizer is, and then it goes through all size 4s and puts it down on the page. And then it establishes it again and puts it down through all size 5. But again, this is all the same value. So we're actually going to change this up a little bit. So for font sizer, right before the number 5, I'm actually going to say instead, hey, get the new width and then divide it by the global multiplier times this number that I've created, 115. And I've created all these numbers that's right ready for you in the code that basically identifies how big or how small each font size is in relation to each other. And I'll show you what I mean. You could see on our Stage 3 website here that I used the Atom font a lot. I like that font. It's pretty cool. It's kind of Art Deco. And as you can see, I have different classes that determine whatever size font I actually need, from extra large all the way down to extra small, right? And I actually do the same thing with Helvetica as well. Here's Helvetica, same thing. So how does it actually determine these numbers? How big is extra large versus large? Well, to be honest, it's just subjective. It's just what your artistic eye thinks it should be. Just judging by maybe medium. Medium looks like it could go a lot bigger. So I would actually change the numbers in my fonts here. These 115s, that 140 right there. These dial in how big or small, the font sizes are in relation to each other. This one is a little bit more nicer curve. Again, medium could probably go a little bit bigger, but you're going to get a feel for that as you determine what's needed on your websites. So that's why I have these numbers in here, and you could fine tune these numbers. So just putting this code with size 1 through 5 together, here they all are. And my numbers basically go from 270 down to about 37. And what this actually is doing is size 10 is really big, right? So you're saying the font sizer is actually going to be the new width, the browser window, times the global multiplier times 37. And what that actually means is if you want a smaller font, the numbers increase up. And if you want a bigger font, the numbers increase down to 0. And you could tweak these numbers in, but I find that these numbers kind of work pretty much for every single purpose. Now, putting this in as a function right here, it will go and change all your fonts and all your type and stuff like that, and it looks great. But there's just a couple of things that you want to do left. Basically, we're done, and we just want to make sure that the page is going to look great, and when someone loads it up, it doesn't see all these funny fonts all changing sizes really quickly. So all we need is a couple of event listeners, okay? And what an event listener is, it's simply a little JavaScript thing that says, hey, I'm listening or I'm waiting for you to either load the page or refresh the page. And the event listener for actually refreshing the page looks like this. It's just window, the event listener, and anytime you resize the browser window after the page is already loaded, it's going to run through the refresh text function again, which is right up here. This is the refresh text function, okay? Simple. So every time you resize the page, it goes through all these sizes again, just like it's doing right here. Every time I resize this page, it's running through the refresh function, and it's happening so fast you can't even see it. But what happens when you want to reload the page? Well, we'll add one more listener to that. And that one is basically saying, hey, as soon as the window is loaded for the very first time, also run through that function. Now, this isn't going to hide the fact that the fonts are going to start out whatever they are natively in the code and then switch on you. But I want to make sure that I actually hide that from the viewer, because that's not very attractive when you load a page and you see everything and then it kind of fixes itself. So what I do for that, and I do this for pretty much every single page, is that I go right over here to the body, and in the actual cascading style sheet, or you could do it right here in the tag itself, I say, hey, make the display of the body, which is basically the entire website, make it none, so it's invisible, so you can't even see it. Now, why would I do that? Because once I go through the refresh text function and it fixes everything, then I'm actually going to go through very quickly and say, now fade in my website. And here's the code to fade it in. It's just jQuery tag, body tag, which is sitting right here, fade in at a speed of 500. That's all that is. So that's why you'll notice whenever I hit refresh here, you don't see these fonts actually fix themselves. All you see is the web page fade up, just like that, fading up. And you could slow that down if you want. Maybe I'll make it like 4,500. I'm going to save that. So that's it. That's the whole secret to that. It's just a little bit of code that you can literally copy and paste to any website you want. And you're free to say, hey, this text here is going to be impact size 4. I'll hit save. I'll jump over. I'll refresh. And there's Lincoln Project size 4. And very, very quickly, I could also just say, hey, give me the Western font, and it's actually size 2. Save that, take a look, refresh, and now it's, boom, the Western font, much smaller, right? But it still scales great. And the reason why these are all funny looking and broken is because we haven't put the code in yet for those. As you can see, it's got the right font, but it doesn't have the right sizes put to them. And right over here, when we were putting in how fast or slow the fade in actually is, if we want to increase the fade in, maybe 4,500, save that, hit refresh, and here it comes fading in much slower. I wouldn't recommend making your audience wait that long for a web page to come in, but that hides the effect that it's working on. And that's basically it. So There's really no reason at all to have funny looking fonts that are jumping all over the place, ruining your margins, ruining your aesthetic, ruining your beautiful web and graphic design skills and the presentation and look that you want to show your users and your audience. And again, it's not very VFX centric, and I know we're a VFX site, but presenting your VFX work is really just as important as having amazing VFX work. Because if it's a really, really, really bad site, who knows? Somebody may judge you on that, and they may not even click play on your demo reel that gets you that dream job in that field that you want. So I hope you enjoyed this little campfire. We won't do any JavaScript anymore after this. This was just kind of a little sidebar. But my hopes is that it makes a little bit more beauty on the web for you and your audience. Thanks so much. See you in the next campfire, everybody.